Welcome back to Center Home Groups. I'm glad you've joined us today. I just want to give you a couple of updates. Jacob and I have our new Generational Faith podcast being released this Friday, and we're continuing our series on the 7 deadly sins, and we are up to wrath. What is wrath, you may ask? Good question. We have not recorded that yet, so I can't give it away. It should be interesting to see how do we deal with God's wrath? What is that all about? How does that affect our lives? So we hope you'll tune in. It'll be on YouTube, but it'll also be anywhere you can find your podcast. And then lastly, I almost didn't mention this because we're almost there. If you haven't signed up for the Valentine's dinner, that is this Saturday. If you haven't signed up, there's still time. You can still come, single, adult. It's a great youth fundraiser. So hope you join us then and enjoy today's study. I remember the first time Cheryl and I were picking out the plans for our first house together. We'd got married in 1997, and we were moving out of her house in Beech Grove into a new house we were being built. Now it wasn't a custom house where we were having everything designed down to the T. It was a home you got to pick from certain plans, but you got to pick what you wanted and what you didn't. I loved the fireplace. I loved the cul-de-sac that we were being put on. It was fun picking out where we wanted things, and looking back, we loved that house. In fact, one of the things the great memories about that house that I'll always cherish is as it was being built, I remember the upstairs was done, not the walls, but the floor. And we went out there Cheryl said, why don't we go look at the house? And I remember walking up the stairs and I seen on one of the bedrooms that was up there in the windowsill, there was nothing but the frame. There was a balloon and I think a coffee mug. And it was like a celebratory, like a congratulations kind of a thing. And I'm like, what in the world is this about? And that's when she sprang the news that she was pregnant with Claire. So it's just a neat moment that I'll always remember about designing this house. So why are we talking about designing houses? I want you to imagine this. Imagine that an architect designing your new house, you're getting a new house and they're designing this. Well, the blueprint is essential. I know when we picked out our house, you've got to have everything designed how you want it. You see, it provides the structure and the guidelines and the vision for what the house should become. But you know what? Once the house is built, well, the blueprint is no longer the focus because the house itself is, right? Well, similarly, Jesus did not come to discard the law, which is the blueprint. He came to complete it, to bring its purpose into full reality. And that's really what we're talking about today. We're talking about, as we started a couple weeks ago, on the Sermon on the Mount. And I just pictured Jesus talking about this sermon that he would have given so many times. But this was recorded in early Matthew, starting in chapter 5. And he's on this mount. He's sitting down because that's what teachers did back then. And all the people, not only the 12 disciples, but lots of people would have been surrounded hearing about his ministry and the kingdom that he came to fulfill. And so the first part of this, we're going to break this into 2 separate parts. Fulfillment of the law, because if we look at all 7 parts, it's quite a bit. So we're going to look at fulfillment of the law and some other sections right after that in the Sermon on the Mount. Here again, chapter 5, verse 17 of Matthew says, do not think, and Jesus is talking, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. You see, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. You see, Jesus wanted to make it clear. You see, he had authority apart from the law of Moses, but not in contradiction to it. You see, Jesus added nothing to the law except one thing, that no man had ever added to the law, perfect obedience. You see, this is certainly one way Jesus came to fulfill the law. And even though he often challenged some, the men and women's interpretations of the law, especially the Sabbath regulations, Jesus never broke the law of God. And he goes on, for truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, no, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. You see, the jot and the title were small marks in Hebrew writings. Jesus here was telling us that not only the ideas of the Word of God are important, but also the words themselves. Even the letters of the words are so important. I mean, these are coming straight from God, right? So this shows us how highly God regards His Word. And he goes on in verse 21, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago. Now he's talking about reading of the law of the Pharisees that had been read to them many times over, all these Jewish people who were hearing this, that says, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or a sister will be subject to judgment. You see, what's happening here is Jesus shows his authority. He wanted them to understand the kingdom, the place he had in God's kingdom, and he does not rely on the words of the previous scribes or teachers. He will teach them the true understanding of the law of Moses. You see, we should emphasize, though, that Jesus is not saying that anger is as bad as murder. You see, it's profoundly morally confused to think that someone who shouts at another person in anger has sinned as badly as someone who murders another person in anger. But Jesus is emphasizing that the law condemns both without saying that the law says they are the same thing. The laws of the people could only deal with the outward act of murder. But here Jesus is declaring that his followers understood God's morality, addressed not only to the end, but also the beginning of murder that leads to it, Have you ever heard of the description, the analogy of holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer? I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's kind of what we're doing. I mean, think about it. It may start off as a small offense that somebody hurts you, but if nurtured, it poisons our heart and our relationships. So Jesus teaches us that righteousness is not just about avoiding murder, but also about uprooting the anger that leads to it. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," he says, is answerable to the court. And anyone who shouts, "You fool," will not be in danger of the fire of hell. So you call somebody Raka, express contempt for their intelligence. That's what they're talking about. Calling someone a fool showed contempt for their character. But either one broke the heart of the law against murder, even if it did not commit murder. In fact, William Barclay puts it this way. The commentator says, "I have translated the idea behind Raka as nitwit or blockhead or numbskull, bonehead, brainless idiot." Hopefully we've never called people this. Raka is an almost untranslatable word because it describes the tone of voice more than anything else. So if you've raised your voice to people in anger, that's what they're talking about. It's the whole accent is the accent of contempt. It is the word of one who despises another with arrogant contempt. And he goes on in verse 23. "Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, well, you know what? You need to leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come back and offer your gift." So what's happening here is Jesus considers it far more important to be reconciled to a brother or a sister than to perform a religious duty. You see, Jesus tells us we first must be reconciled to your brother. We can't think that our service towards the Lord justifies bad relationships with other people. And Paul expresses the same idea in Ephesians 4:26 and 27 when he says, "Do not let the sun go down on your wrath." So when we hold on to our anger against another, we then sin. We give the place to the devil. Verse 25 goes, "Settle matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court, and do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and that judge may hand you over to the officer, and you'd be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny." And then he goes on about adultery in verse 27. He goes, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.'" So here again, just like he did with murder, he's reminding them, you've heard this said, you've heard your Jewish scribes and your religious leaders, the Pharisees, talk about this from the law in the past, right? But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And at this point, I have to think they're looking at him thinking, what? What are you talking about? That's crazy. So if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. You see, it's better for you to lose one part of your body than the whole body be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to stumble, well, cut it off, throw it away, because it's better for you to lose one body part than for you to lose the whole body and go into hell, which, if you think of this literally, I mean, nobody wants to take an eye out because they looked at someone lustfully or cut an arm off because they did something that was sinful. But what he's telling here is how important it is to take these matters seriously because it affects our whole body. You see, it's important to understand that Jesus is not saying that the act of adultery and adultery in the heart are the same thing, just like murder, right? More than a few people have been deceived at this point and say, I've already committed adultery in my heart, so I might as well do it in practice. But the act of adultery is far worse than adultery in the heart. Jesus' point is not to say they're the same thing, but to say they are both sin and both prohibited by the command against adultery. Some people only keep from adultery because they're afraid to get caught. And in their heart, they commit adultery every day. You see, it's good that they keep from the act of adultery, but it's bad that they fill their hearts with that adultery. And I'm going to end with something I said. If you paid attention to my message I gave on the topic of hot topics of sex at the very end of December, I read this story and it just made an impact on me. And it's talking about taking any kind of lustful thoughts, how impactful they are. So I want to retell this story because I just think it's very impactful. It goes, a wise pastor once said, "Sit down and make a list of all the things that will happen to you if you mishandle your sexuality." I mean, if you literally do this, take down a list of all the things that you would lose or really badly damage if you did some of these things. So he had done that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper and read his list aloud. He told us that if he stepped away from God's intentions for this area of his life, meaning sexuality, well, he stood to lose his marriage. He would lose the trust of his children, his capacity for experiencing intimacy, his ability to worship. He'd undoubtedly end up facing guilt and fear, the temptation to become a hidden person, loss of character, crushing damage to his reputation, weakness the next time he felt temptation, and the deep sadness that he would be passing on a legacy that would compromise his children's ability to trust God. He then added that he kept that list in his pocket all the time. So let me ask you, how serious are you about eliminating every sin out of your life, including the anger, including the lust? See, if you can learn to control your thoughts, which we can do this, but only with the power of the Holy Spirit, then we can eliminate the sins, the little sins that lead to outward actions. Have a great week.
Like and subscribe.